Monday, and that's what happens to be the day that I like to talk about monsters. Hello, and welcome to Monster Mondays. I'm Jeff Arbuckle, co-host of the podcast Film Seizure, that you can catch each Wednesday morning at filmseizure.com or at a number of podcast providers online. We've got ourselves a Golem run amok in England in this week's feature. I'm looking at 1967's It, directed by Herbert J. Leader. Now, while this is a British production, it was directed by an American. Leader was actually a teacher. He made some films, sure, but he was mostly known for being a film professor in New Jersey. However, we've seen something of his before. He wrote Fiend Without a Face. Now, I hadn't heard of this movie, It, before this past summer when I picked it up at Horror Hound, but I certainly know some of the people in the film. We start with Roddy McDowall. I talked about him back when I did the Night Gallery pilot episode when he appeared in one of the better segments that series ever had. But McDowall was hardly a newcomer in 1967. His career was already almost 30 years old at that point. He appeared in How Green Was My Valley, My Friend Flicka, Lassie Come Home, Macbeth, and on throughout the 40s and the 50s. Then, in 1963, he appeared as Octavian in Cleopatra, one of the biggest films ever made up to that point, even if its enormous budget hurt its box office chances to turn a profit. And the following year after It, so 1968, he'd get the role of his lifetime, Planet of the Apes, and he'd appear as Cornelius in 2 of the first 3 films, and then played chimpanzee world forger Caesar for 3 films before playing the lead chimpanzee Galen in a Planet of the Apes TV series. He continued to make all sorts of popular films, from The Poseidon Adventure to voicing Vincent in The Black Hole to Fright Night, which will someday be on this show, and Laser Blast, which has already been on this show. His soft-spoken and super recognizable voice turns out to be kind of a key actor in my lifetime, as I've seen several of those movies throughout my life, particularly The Planet of the Apes and Laser Blast and The Black Hole. Things I saw several times as a kid. But in addition to McDowall, we also have Jill Howarth. Now, she had an uncredited role in The Brides of Dracula for Hammer, which will someday take its bow on Monster Mondays as well. And she was nominated for the Golden Globe for Most Promising Newcomer for Exodus, the same year that she was in The Brides of Dracula. Her primary claim to fame was originating the role of Sally Bowles in the Broadway musical Cabaret in 1966. Interestingly, though, Haworth would not be cast in the film in favor of Liza Minnelli, but Minnelli originally auditioned to play Bowles on Broadway, but she lost out to Haworth because Minnelli was deemed too inexperienced at the time. And lastly, we have Ian McCulloch. Now, McCulloch was mostly known for his Italian horror films like Zombie in 1979, Dr. Butcher, MD, and Contamination, which were both in 1980. Later on, though, he did appear in the 1984 Doctor Who serial Warriors of the Deep. But as for our tale, it begins with a raging fire that the fire brigade is putting out at a London museum's warehouse. And here we meet Arthur Pym, the assistant to the museum's curator, Mr. Grove. They've learned of the fire and they've gone to inspect the damage and what still remains. Now, surprisingly, there's a statue standing alone and undamaged in the middle of where this warehouse once stood. Grove calls the piece as something from a mid-European primitive period, maybe the 16th century or so. There is an inscription in Hebrew on the statue, and when Pym goes to fetch a flashlight so Grove can read it better, Grove dies mysteriously. Now, Pym is a fairly odd chap. He lives at home with his dear old mother, who he speaks to, but she doesn't seem to do much more than just simply rocking in her chair. And he goes on and on about how he has to be named the successor to Mr. Grove and how he will be able to spend more time with Mr. Grove's lovely daughter, Ellen, who he has a crush on. And he tells his mother that he also has a jewel for her to wear for a bit before he has to return it to the museum. It's this giant diamond. And that's when we see why she doesn't respond to him when he talks to her. And that's because she's been long dead and she's just a corpse in that rocking chair. Pym is told that he will not be taking his former boss's role as curator. Instead, he will get a raise, but continue to assist the replacement. And most of this is they just feel like he is too young or too inexperienced. But later on, after the statue has been brought into the museum to be displayed, a technician comes in to figure out lighting for it. And he mocks it despite Pym telling him that isn't so wise to do. But when Pym leaves the room to attend to other business, the statue falls over and pins the technician and kills him. When the police come to investigate an alarm that Pym tripped to replace the large diamond that he let his dead mother wear for a bit, and take an official look at the statue and the dead technician, they aren't too sure that the death was simply an accident. I mean, after all, it took several people in a crane to place that statue in that part of the museum. It shouldn't just be able to tip over on its own. And while they don't outright accuse or place any suspicion on Pym, they don't necessarily buy his story that it just simply tipped over on its own. Also, the papers have started to sensationalize the stories around the statue because now there's 2 dead people that have died next to the statue. But they do find out what this statue is. A representative of the New York Museum, Jim Perkins, tells everybody that that the New York Museum believes that this is the 16th century Golem of Judah Low. In fact, the New York Museum is quite interested in buying the Golem from this British museum. But this Golem was created originally to serve its community. However, at some point along the way, it started to run amok one day and it went missing, thought to be destroyed. But to bring the Golem to life, there's a small scroll that you place into its mouth with the Hebrew word emeth, or truth, or the word of God, inscribed on it. And speaking of inscriptions, there are several carved into the robe worn by the Golem. Basically explains how if power is unleashed, it will bring destruction. Basically, whoever finds the secret to bring it to life, the Golem will serve that person no matter what their intentions are. It also explains what it is impervious to. In the 17th century, it couldn't be destroyed by fire. In the 18th century, it couldn't be destroyed by fire or water. In the 19th century, it can't be destroyed by fire, water, or force, i.e. breaking it apart. In the 20th century, fire, water, force, nor anything created by man can destroy it. And then, in the 21st century, the inscription says, "He who evokes me must be of God's hand himself, because on this earth the person of man existeth no more." So yeah, this thing is pretty damn unstoppable once you awaken it. And Pym finds this out by taking rubbings from the Golem that of all the inscriptions, and took it to a rabbi. And the rabbi says it's pretty much the most powerful force on earth today, even more powerful than a hydrogen bomb. And that's because it will either go on serving or destroying based on whoever awakens it and what their desires are. But later, Pym communes with the Golem and asks where the scroll is, and the Golem points downward with its right hand before quickly putting it back to its original position. And Pym discovers there's a hidden compartment in the Golem's right foot that the scroll has been kept in, and he places it into the Golem's mouth, and we hear a heart beating. When the new curator and Pym's new boss comes in and fires Pym for insubordination, Pym commands the Golem kill the new curator. Now, Pym gets a little more forward with Ellen after this too, not realizing that she's falling for the American Perkins. He wants to take her on holiday, and he tells her about how he can do all these amazing things. And he points to a bridge that they're walking by and says, like, knock over that bridge. Now, she doesn't find this all that endearing. She excuses herself and goes home after he says he would destroy bridges for her. You know, a normal thing that a guy might tell a woman that he's trying to woo. But that night, Pym has a little bit of a mental break when he wakes up in the middle of the night, looks at his mother in her bed, and basically screams in anguish. Now, Pym reactivates the golem, and he goes to Hammersmith Bridge to destroy it, as he told Ellen he could. Ellen and Jim Perkins are, at the same time, making out when the news is heard about the collapse of the bridge. She gets a call from Pym at her apartment, raving about the golem, the bridge, and needing to confess something to someone, to anyone. And Jim tells Ellen to meet him so that Jim himself can go and confront Pym when he's expecting to see Ellen and find out if he's been the one holding up the sale of the golem to the American Museum. And when Perkins arrives, Pym understands what's going on between the American and his lady love. So he says that he wants to take Perkins to see the golem. And Perkins spots a small change to the statue. It's almost as if it's alive. They are interrupted by Inspector White, who says a woman witnessed someone or something that matches the description of the golem walking away from the bridge after it collapsed. Pym considers something Perkins says about how the golem might run amok if it goes on destroying things like he's commanded it to do, and he activates the golem again and explains that he needs it to destroy itself. He wants it to swallow the scroll and then walk into the Thames. But the next morning, when he gets to the museum, it has returned to its pedestal it usually stands on. So he tries taking the golem to this shed, and he plans to burn it down with, burn the shed down with the golem inside it. But that rabbi told him that wouldn't work, and sure enough, it does not. Now, Perkins saw Pym lead the golem out of the museum that night. So between the inspector's suspicions that Pym is up to some sort of foul play and Perkins' knowledge, it gets Pym arrested and thrown into a holding cell that is something like an insane asylum. And the golem comes and busts Pym out. He, along with the golem and Ellen, whom Pym kidnapped upon escaping from the asylum, go to a museum annex called the Cloisters. Inspector White tells Perkins that the Army has given the approval to use a small nuclear warhead to destroy the golem. And they give Pym a chance to surrender, but he knows that if he goes outside, they'll only arrest him. And he's got it in his head that he's just as immortal as his golem. After all, he thinks he was the only person on Earth who could give life to a lump of stone. And when he finally has enough of Ellen, he orders the golem to take her away because he never wants to see her again. And that allows for Perkins to be able to rescue Ellen, and they get just far away enough from the nuclear blast, and the warhead totally destroys the Cloisters and Pym along with it. However, the golem still stands. The golem simply walks away and into the sea, never to be seen again. So let's get to the three things that I like about 1967's It. First, this is a very British movie. Now, that might sound like I'm taking the piss out of the movie, but there's a stuffiness to this movie that feels appropriate for it. Americans are making movies based on Poe or just importing the gothic horrors from Hammer or what have you. This is about museums and artifacts from Europe's history from centuries ago. Of course, Roddy McDowall's very proper way of speaking is all over this movie as well. But my favorite character of them all is the new curator that comes in to replace Grove, Professor Wheel. Now, this guy is almost a parody of a fussy old British museum curator. I mean, he even says so himself by calling himself a fusspot. And when he introduces himself to Pym, first he kind of looks down on Pym. He treats him as kind of not of his standing, and he's just a jerk to him. But he tells him that they will be doing things very differently than what Grove did. And Wheel says that he heard Grove was a kidder. Well, Wheel also says that he is not. In fact, Wheel says he has no sense of humor whatsoever. This guy must have the stiffest of stiff upper lips in all of England. He's a serious ass too. When Pym was trying to figure out where the Golem's scroll was, this guy comes in and says that as a new rule, he will only allow the night watchman access to the art rooms after hours. I guess he thinks people will either have sticky fingers or will spend too much time admiring the art in a museum. And it's as if this film was purposely making Wheel so unlikable that we are happy that Pym uses the Golem to kill him the first time he activates the thing. Next, the Golem itself is a very interesting thing. I love the inscription that the rabbi reads about the power of the Golem, and how more and more indestructible it will become the older it gets. And there's always some eeriness around things inscribed into statues or scrolls or what have you. This is the first time we've dealt with something directly inspired by the legend of golems and what they signify. More recently, of course, I've talked about the Daimogen trilogy. That very much takes a lot of inspiration from the Hebrew concept of a golem that will either protect or destroy. In each of those films, the Daimogen didn't just destroy everyone once it woke up, it specifically destroyed evildoers. And it was difficult for it to always know when to stop or who was the evildoers. I mean, in the first movie, it takes the woman who woke it up crying at its feet to understand, oh, I've gone far enough. I need to go back to being just a statue again or whatever. But the most popular form of a golem that almost everyone knows is Frankenstein's monster. It's thought that Mary Shelley wrote the book Frankenstein after being inspired by the Golem legend. And that definitely plays a lot of similar thematic parallels. If you think about the inscription on the Golem in this movie, it's basically warning you against letting something you don't have full control over out of the bag. Basically, once you give it life, you can't really stop it from doing things. Obviously, destroying and killing is bad, but it could also do that to something while protecting a town or an individual person to the point that it's zealous in that charge. And this movie really succeeds in that symbolism. You can definitely say there's a little bit too much going on here with the Pym character. He's meek. He doesn't handle rejection from his love interest all that well. He isn't really all that talented to move up at the museum, and therefore just kind of stumbles up the ladder through the removal of the curators ahead of him. And of course, he keeps the corpse of his mother around to talk to. Now, he's got some major issues, and the Golem gives him power for maybe the first time in his life. And the one main thing I would say either needs to be removed or kind of just handled in a very different way is the obvious Psycho ripoff of Pym keeping the corpse of his dead mother around and having lines about how he wouldn't be giving her as much attention if he's got Ellen around and so forth. That felt more shoehorned in just to say that this guy is emotionally damaged. But if we were properly told that McDowall's Pym is just kind of a lonely loser, you have this monster that can now give him some worth. And despite that worth kind of coming from ill intent, the Golem creature is the real star of this movie because it does look good. The actor playing the statue is good at simultaneously being lifeless at times and very obviously something that is alive but standing as still as possible. And it is a neat creation and is an interesting centerpiece to this movie. Now, lastly, you might have noticed I kind of rushed past the whole nuclear bomb thing, didn't I? Well, don't worry. This movie did too. Here's a story about a Norman Bates-like character who's a lonely loser that I just described. And he's got issues, and you could just have him be a sort of dangerous guy through those issues that he has. But then you introduce this powerful thing of Hebrew mysticism. And that's what this movie is really about. That lonely loser using this mystic thing to have power. And I just went through all of that too. However, the movie made the monster so powerful that there was no way to get rid of the thing. So in the last 10 minutes of the movie, I kid you not, they introduced the concept of ridding the world of Arthur Pym by way of a tactical 1-mile radius blast thermonuclear detonation. I mean, how else are you going to write yourself out of the corner of making the Golem indestructible? Am I right? There is no lead up to that decision to drop a bomb onto Roddy McDowall's head. But think about this for a second. Someone like Perkins would have to convince first the inspector that Pym has brought a mystical Hebrew artifact to life. Then that inspector would have to convince his superior, who would then have to convince his superior, who would then have to find someone on a municipal level to convince, who then has to convince someone on a regional level, who then would have to convince someone on a national level, who would then have to convince the prime freaking minister of the United Kingdom that a mystical Hebrew statue is alive and indestructible, so he better send a nuke. And that might sound like I'm criticizing this plot point. But boy, oh boy, I am not. I love that we went from a psycho ripoff to a fairly interesting mystical creature feature to being told with 10 minutes left in this movie that a nuke is on its way, to that nuke being exploded in the final minute of the movie. Remember when I talked about Attack of the Crab Monsters a few weeks ago, and I said that it went somewhere I had no idea it would go with the handling of the monsters and the concept itself? Well, it's another situation here. I really can't tell you how surprised I am that in the final minute of this movie, the British government decided to nuke a museum annex to rid the world of a mystical, magical Hebrew statue. That's really something else, and I have to applaud this movie for going there. But that wraps up this week's Monster Mondays. You can catch new episodes of Monster Mondays each Monday at filmseizure.com. Don't forget to follow Film Seizure at Facebook, Threads, and Instagram. And be sure to subscribe to Film Seizure to get both the Film Seizure podcast and Monster Mondays at your favorite podcast providers, as well as YouTube. You can also check out my website, bmovieanima.com, to read new review articles every Friday morning. Next time, we kick off a whole month of Toho Japanese monster films that do not star Godzilla, but will feature a couple of recognizable creatures nonetheless. And we start with 1962's Gorath. So until next week, stay spooky.